Welcome to Craftlit, the podcast for crafters who love books. My name is Heather Ordover, and I'm podcasting from where the Delaware River meets the Old York Road, New Hope, Pennsylvania. Episode 564, With Love to Tracee. This episode of Craftlit is brought to you by you. Thank you. Well, hello. How are you? I am sad. I am very, very sad. Our linchpin for all of our Craftlit Zooms on Tuesday mornings, Eastern Time, and Tuesday and Thursday evenings, also Eastern Time. The linchpin that holds this all together, Tracee Tompkins, has had a completely hellish week. If you're in the Craftlit Facebook group, you may have seen a post from her. On Sunday, she lost her father, and then Tuesday afternoon, after our Zoom call in the morning, she went to pick up her daughter at the airport, who flew in for her father's funeral. And when she got home, she found out her husband had passed away. I know there are people who say, God never gives you more than what you can handle. There are moments when I think that's just bunk. And this is one of those moments. I know there's a lot of love heading your way, Tracee, from all of Craftlit. I know it doesn't replace anything, but it's something. And it's moments like this that make me think about how many murder mysteries I've read. And not that anybody in Tracee's life passed away violently, but it's easy to gloss over the fact that the other people in the story, even the story that we're reading now, lost somebody. And it's just all pretty horrid. Fortunately, this week, we don't see any of the people who were most connected to the character who passed away in the Leavenworth case. So that's good. That's because we have to finish the inquest. Today's chapter is another one of those chapters that made it pretty clear to me why the Pennsylvania legislature had a hard time accepting that a book like this was written by a little woman. Jennifer last night on the Zoom chat said something that I have felt since I first listened to probably the first third of this book. It has the odd capacity to time jump. It goes from feeling like a story that was written in 1878 to something that was written in the 20th century, easily. And then all of a sudden, as Jennifer said, they have to go somewhere and they aren't getting into a car. There's a lot of kind of like Dracula with the train timetables and the boat timetables. In this, there's a lot of horse and horse-drawn carriage timetables and habits. We're going to hit some stuff that I'm actually having a hard time researching. It's rather easy to find information on, for instance, coach travel in Jane Austen's England and how the coach network and the coaching system was set up. It's a little harder to find that information out for 1878 New York City. It's just not. I just have not stumbled upon or figured out how to Google information like that. So if you are the keeper of such information and feel like sharing, please let me know. You can get me at heather@craftlit.com, or you can get me at area code 206-350-1642 and let me know that way. Either one should work. I am in the process of finding another way for you to contact me if you live out of the country. Obviously, you could record a voice memo on a portable electronic device and email that to heather@craftlit.com, and that would work just fine. That would be great. Craftiness has been limited on my end, although I did make a face mask for Amy in Seattle, which she was very sweet. She shared with everybody last night on the Thursday night Zoom, and I did something slightly different for her. There's a Breathe Easy mask that I know I mentioned. It was probably about a year ago, actually, where a woman had done a bunch of fabric research and found out that even a single layer of a polyester spandex blend, it was a blend of, I think it's 90% polyester and 10% spandex, did a very good job of filtering out very small particles. And we know that the coronavirus, when it is airborne, not using that term as a term of art or a scientific term, just when the stuff is in the air and people can inhale it, it's a very small particle. So this fabric does a particularly good job of blocking it. For one thing, it's very tightly woven, as you know from things like swimsuits. Anytime you've got spandex in there, stuff, when it's not being stretched out, is very tightly woven. The other part about it that is unique is, as anyone knows who has tried to do something like, oh, I don't know, make a skirt or blouse out of any kind of lightweight, chiffon-y, light polyester, stuff carries static electricity. Turns out that that's a really good way to block particulate matter. So if you have lived a life of pretty serious asthma, and if putting a mask on makes you feel claustrophobic and like you can't get any air in, this is an option. I took the best fitting, most face type fitting mask pattern that I'd found, which was I think it's actually called the Best Fit Mask. Everybody calls their mask that. But I will share the link to the video, all of the videos again, but the fit video as well, because Amy had said that even putting a zip tie into the seam of an Olsen mask down the middle so that it would kind of hold the mask off of your face, even that wasn't enough for her, because if the fabric was too thick, it would still retain moisture. And the minute it starts to retain moisture and touches her face when she inhales, it starts to, make it feel like you can't get any air. And then, reality be damned. Those are those kind of involuntary reactions that we have to things. So I made her a mask where the part covering her mouth was a single layer of this polyester spandex chiffon. And at Joann's Fabrics in the United States, it is referred to as a chiffon. And then I made the nose and the chin portion out of a doubled over piece of fabric. And I took those coffee bag closures, the ones that are plastic, but they have bendable plastic, but they have metal bands encased in there so that they really hold their shape nicely. I stitched 2 of those into, one over the nose and one under the chin, because I also wasn't sure. I know that for me, if I have something that feels like it's tickling under my neck or tickling my chin, I find that to be very unpleasant and disconcerting. So I wanted to make sure that she had some ability to fit that sucker under her chin. And then I put the ear straps on, made sure that they were a little bit bigger than any human should necessarily want, and then put some of the little rubberized slider doohickeys, this is all technical terminology, I'm sure you know, onto the earpieces, and I sent it off to her. And she shared it out last night that, in fact, it does fit, it does work, and glory be. I am so happy because she has to get on a 5-hour flight this coming week, and I could not stand the thought of her having to deal with that for such a long time and going and coming when I might have the ability to help out. Along with that, it led to a discussion of fabrics and neck gaiters. And neck gaiters, as you might know, those are those like neck socks that people wear, like the what do they call them on Survivor? It was a big deal. They used to call them buffs. So you could wear it as a tank top or a tube top or wear it as a hairband or triple roll it around your hair and create a ponytail holder. Or evidently you could wear it as a mask. And there was a study that got a lot of airplay on the news. And this just goes to show you that when the news reports on science, you should probably go do some research, Heather, because I believed this as well, and I was so wrong. Back probably about a year ago, there's a whole mess load of talk about this one researcher who found out that neck gaiters were ineffective, and there was some hypothesis that somebody came up with. It is not the researcher. That what was in fact happening was that because the weave of the fabric was so tight and stretchy, as it stretched over your mouth and nose, if you breathed out or coughed or sneezed out, the fabric would actually break the particulate matter up into smaller particles. And therefore, it would be more airborne, more transmissible, more easily able to travel from somebody's mouth to your nose. And in fact, that was not the key takeaway from the research. I actually have the research. I will link to it for you from the show notes so that you can take a look at it for yourself. It wasn't that. So what they actually came away with was anything covering your nose and mouth is great, because nothing covering your nose or mouth is really bad. So it's letting the perfect be the enemy of the good. Not so wise in a pandemic. Just like I finally heard why the WHO in the beginning of this pandemic didn't recommend masks right off the bat. There were, I'm sorry, Sai, I am going to posit a bunch of men around a table who discussed masks and masking and came away with this. We shouldn't recommend that people wear masks because people will touch their faces and therefore their masks, and then they will touch other things and they will transmit the virus anyway. So, because people's stupid, good mask, just say no. I mean, what kind of crazy person? When I read that, I just wanted to scream. But I'm finding some of that in my current situation as well. Just because it might not be used perfectly or consistently even, doesn't mean it's not something to recommend. So I'm really glad that the mask worked for Amy, and I will link out to everything for you. The other crafty thing that happened this week also goes to Tracee Tompkins. I believe, actually, Tracee and her daughter, Tommy, win the week because Tracee doesn't have a Swift and had wanted one, and they're ridiculously expensive. So why bother? She was trying to figure out, could you build one out of Legos? Because they do have those parts, that you could put a propeller on so it would spin. They have those kinds of parts. Instead, I think it was a friend of hers mentioned, you could make one out of Connex blocks, Connex. So Tracee and her daughter had the Connex. Oh, it was her sister who said to do this. So Tracee had the Connex blocks on hand, and Tommy made it, and it works. And it works really well. And I'm going to try and get the picture from Tracee because you will marvel. It wasn't nearly as big as I thought it was, but I'll tell you, when I was looking at it and saw these Connex blocks, if you've never seen them before, they're kind of like bristle blocks, a little bit. Old school bristle blocks. Those were actually a thing, now that I'm thinking about it. It's not just a descriptive term. That's a thing. These Connex blocks, because they have a bristly appearance to them, actually do a pretty good job of keeping the yarn in place on the Swift, which I actually think is better than a crazy slippery Swift. So, I mean, call me crazy, but I thought this was just genius. So that I am also sharing with you. I don't think I've had this many links in show notes in forever. So that's kind of fun. The Leavenworth case. So today we have chapter 3 of the Leavenworth case. This is still the inquest, and this chapter is called Facts and Deductions. Mr. Grice does not appear in this chapter. We are sticking with our narrator for this entire chapter and watching him watch the people in the inquest. I find him to have a very low-key but funny, kind of genteelly snarky commentary running during this, because he has something to say about everyone who either speaks or people who for some reason draw his notice, and he's a kind of politely judgy about the people who are there. And this is one of those moments where having a British reader really pays off, actually, because here we get an Irish butler. So he does a much better job than I would have done. So let's see. There are two words that just don't get used very much. It's not that they're so difficult or archaic or anything like that. We just don't say these words very often. One is prepossessing, which turns out to have a dumpster load of very slightly distinctive, marginally different definitions in the OED. And they're not so much definitions, it's more like, the denotation and connotation thing. Something denotes a particular meaning. That's like the letter of the law. And a connotation is kind of what you hear. It's kind of the spirit of the law. There was a lot of letter and spiriting going on in prepossessing. When it is used here, it is used as somebody giving off a favorable impression. The word attractive kept coming up in the OED, but I don't think it's attractive necessarily like, oh, he's hot. I think it's more attractive like, good presentation. It's kind of like the British baking show. Sometimes, or the TV show, the American show, Nailed It, where non-bakers are brought on to try to copy professional bakers' works of art. And, they're just appalling. And luckily, the people who are doing the cooking are having a good time at creating appalling stuff as well. Nailed it. So with prepossessing, back to prepossessing for a moment. It's not so much that somebody is a hottie as it is somebody who has put themselves together well and is presenting well. So prepossessing. That's the one of dozens of definitions that we are going to use today. The other word is one that just doesn't get enough airplay, which is amanuensis. Now, if you've spent any time watching Star Kid Productions on YouTube and their musicals, notably, their first one was a Harry Potter musical, which was a ridiculous Harry Potter parody musical, starring Darren Criss, who went on to do a lot on Glee. There was that. And then that group of people, this was all in Los Angeles, I believe, got together and kept getting together, and they started writing their own non-fanfic musicals and coming up with their own storylines. The best, flat out the best of all of these was Twisted, the true story of Jafar. It's the one that they, I think, videotaped professionally because the sound quality is better and the video quality is certainly better than most of their other early productions. And I highly recommend it. The kids were not sure if I was going to like it since I worked on Aladdin. I'm watching it going, this is genius. It's the entire movie, Aladdin, from Jafar's point of view. So Aladdin is this little schmuck who you just want to smack. And Jasmine is spoiled and not particularly charming. And it's just a lot of fun. So there's that. But they also did, I think it's called The Guy Who Really Hates Musicals, or The Guy Who Really Hated Musicals. And it is kind of like if you took something along the lines of Invasion of the Body Snatchers and turned it into a musical. I think that's kind of accurate. Anyway, the reason I bring it up is because that's the first time in modern times that I heard the word amanuensis being used repeatedly, and it struck me as kind of odd. Amanuensis, as we will hear it used today, is a noun. I'm looking at the OED now. The plural is amanuenses. I know you're shocked. Shocked! It is a borrowing from the Latin, which, strangely enough, is amanuensis. In classical Latin, amanuensis itself means a secretary or clerk. A manu, 2 words, meant secretary, which was actually a shortening of servus amanu, a slave of the hand. And then you get the ensis, which is a suffix that indicates it's a person, I think, if I am not completely wrong. The way it wound up getting used in our world, instead of a Latin-speaking ancient world, is a literary assistant, someone who takes dictation or someone who copies out text for you, which is exactly what you will hear in today's chapter. How cool is that? First recorded use of it, not as Latin but as English, was R. Burton in Anatomy Melancholy, where he's talking about Democritus allowing him 6 or 7 amanuenses to write out his dictates. And that was 1632. Then in 1774, Mr. Tucker, in writing the book Light of Nature Pursued, which was released in 1777, said Caesar could dictate to 3 amanuenses together. That's kind of impressive. But when you think about how long it takes to handwrite something, actually, I can totally see somebody like Caesar holding his place in 3 different letters that he was dictating to 3 different scribes, amanuenses. Caesar, I tell you what. And then it, just came forward in time. I'm looking at all of the usages, and yes, I would say it is almost exclusively used literarily to indicate somebody who is taking not just dictation, not like letters. In the modern usage, it appears to be, and modern, I mean after 1700s, almost exclusively used to indicate someone who is taking dictation for a work of either fiction or nonfiction. But it's not a 1950s secretary taking shorthand for a boss man on Madison Avenue, she said, thinking of Mad Men. So, prepossessing, favorable impression, or attractive. And amanuensis, a literary secretary, someone in particular who writes as the author speaks. And that's it. Let's listen to chapter 3. It's a long chapter. It's an inquest, and we have to hear from some people. We kind of had the setup to the inquest last week. Today, we hear from witnesses. And here we go with chapter 3 of the Leavenworth case by Amy Catherine Green, read for us by Kevin Green at LibriVox. Here we go.
Chapter 3. Facts and Deductions. Confusion now hath made his masterpiece, most sacrilegious murder hath broke ope the Lord's anointed temple, and stolen thence the life of the building. Macbeth. Turning my attention back into the room where I was, I found the coroner consulting a memorandum through a very impressive pair of gold eyeglasses. "Is the butler here?" he asked. Immediately there was a stir among the group of servants in the corner, and an intelligent-looking, though somewhat pompous, Irishman stepped out from their midst and confronted the jury. Ah, thought I to myself, as my glance encountered his precise whiskers, steady eye, and respectfully attentive, though by no means humble expression. Here is a model servant who is likely to prove a model witness. And I was not mistaken. Thomas the butler was in all respects 1 in 1,000, and he knew it. The coroner, upon whom, as upon all others in the room, he seemed to have made the like favourable impression, proceeded without hesitation to interrogate him. "Your name, I am told, is Thomas Doherty?" "Yes, sir." "Well, Thomas, how long have you been employed in your present situation?" "It must be a matter of 2 years now, sir." "You are the person who first discovered the body of Mr. Leavenworth?" "Yes, sir, I and Mr. Harwell." "And who is Mr. Harwell?" "Mr. Harwell is Mr. Leavenworth's private secretary, sir, the one who did his writing." "Very good. Now, at what time of the day or night did you make this discovery?" "It was early, sir. Early this morning, about 8." "And where?" "In the library, sir, off Mr. Leavenworth's bedroom. We had forced our way in, feeling anxious about his not coming to breakfast." "You forced your way in? The door was locked, then?" "Yes, sir." "On the inside?" "That I cannot tell. There was no key in the door." "Where was Mr. Leavenworth lying when you first found him?" "He was not lying, sir. He was seated at the large table in the centre of the room, his back to the bedroom door, leaning forward, his head on his hands." "How was he dressed?" "In his dinner suit, sir, just as he came from the table last night." "Were there any evidences in the room that a struggle had taken place?" "No, sir." "Any pistol on the floor or table?" "No, sir." "Any reason to suppose that a robbery had been attempted?" "No, sir. Mr. Leavenworth's watch and purse were both in his pockets." Being asked to mention who were in the house at the time of the discovery, he replied, "The young ladies, Miss Mary Leavenworth and Miss Eleanor, Mr. Harwell, Kate the cook, Molly the upstairs girl, and myself." "The usual members of the household?" "Yes, sir." "Now, tell me whose duty it is to close up the house at night?" "Mine, sir." "Did you secure it as usual last night?" "I did, sir." "Who unfastened it this morning?" "I, sir." "How did you find it?" "Just as I left it." "What, not a window open nor a door unlocked?" "No, sir." By this time you could have heard a pin drop. The certainty that the murderer, whoever he was, had not left the house, at least till after it was opened in the morning, seemed to weigh upon all minds. Forewarned as I had been of the fact, I could not but feel a certain degree of emotion at having it thus brought before me, and, moving so as to bring the butler's face within view, searched it for some secret token that he had spoken thus emphatically in order to cover up some failure of duty on his own part, but it was unmoved in its candour, and sustained the concentrated gaze of all in the room like a rock. Being now asked when he had last seen Mr. Leavenworth alive, he replied, "At dinner last night." "He was, however, seen later by some of you?" "Yes, sir. Mr. Harwell says he saw him as late as 10:30 in the evening." "What room do you occupy in this house?" "A little one on the basement floor." "And where do the other members of the household sleep?" "Mostly on the 3rd floor, sir. The ladies in the large back rooms, and Mr. Harwell in the little one in the front. The girls sleep above." "There was no one on the same floor with Mr. Leavenworth?" "No, sir." "At what hour did you go to bed?" "Well, I should say about 11." "Did you hear any noise in the house, either before or after that time, that you remember?" "No, sir." "So that the discovery you made this morning was a surprise to you?" "Yes, sir." Requested now to give a more detailed account of that discovery, he went on to say that it was not till Mr. Leavenworth failed to come to his breakfast at the call of the bell that any suspicion arose in the house that all was not right. Even then they waited some little time before doing anything, but as minute after minute went by and he did not come, Miss Eleanor grew anxious, and finally left the room, saying she would go and see what was the matter, but soon returned, looking very much frightened, saying she had knocked at her uncle's door, and had even called to him, but could get no answer, at which Mr. Harwell and himself had gone up and together tried both doors, and finding them locked, burst open that of the library, when they came upon Mr. Leavenworth, as he had already said, sitting at the table, dead. "And the ladies?" "Oh, they followed us up and came into the room, and Miss Eleanor fainted away." "And the other one, Miss Mary, I believe they call her?" "I don't remember anything about her. I was so busy fetching water to restore Miss Eleanor, I didn't notice." "Well, how long was it before Mr. Leavenworth was carried into the next room?" "Almost immediate, as soon as Miss Eleanor recovered, and that was as soon as ever the water touched her lips." "Who proposed that the body should be carried from the spot?" "She, sir. As soon as ever she stood up, she went over to it and looked at it and shuddered, and then calling Mr. Harwell and me, bade us carry him in and lay him on the bed and go for the doctor, which we did." "Wait a moment. Did she go with you when you went into the other room?" "No, sir." "What did she do?" "She stayed by the library table." "What doing?" "I couldn't see. Her back was to me." "How long did she stay there?" "She was gone when we came back." "Gone from the table?" "Gone from the room." "When did you see her again?" "In a minute. She came in at the library door as we went out." "Anything in her hand?" "Not as I see." "Did you miss anything from the table?" "I never thought to look, sir. The table was nothing to me. I was only thinking of going for the doctor, though I knew it was of no use." "Whom did you leave in the room when you went out?" "The cook, sir, and Molly, sir, and Miss Eleanor." "Not Miss Mary?" "No, sir." "Very well. Have the jury any questions to put to this man?" A movement at once took place in that profound body. "I should like to ask a few," exclaimed a weazen-faced, excitable little man, whom I had before noticed shifting in his seat in a restless manner strongly suggestive of an intense but hitherto repressed desire to interrupt the proceedings. "Very well, sir," returned Thomas. But the juryman, stopping to draw a deep breath, a large and decidedly pompous man who sat at his right hand, seized the opportunity to inquire, in a round, listen-to-me sort of voice, "You say you have been in the family for 2 years. What was it you might call a united family?" "United?" "Affectionate, you know, on good terms with each other." And the juryman lifted the very long and heavy watch chain that hung across his vest, as if that as well as himself had a right to a suitable and well-considered reply. The butler, impressed perhaps by his manner, glanced uneasily around. "Yes, sir, so far as I know." "The young ladies were attached to their uncle?" "Oh, yes, sir." "And to each other?" "Well, yes, I suppose so. It's not for me to say." "You suppose so. Have you any reason to think otherwise?" And he doubled the watch chain about his fingers, as if he would double its attention as well as his own. Thomas hesitated a moment, but just as his interlocutor was about to repeat his question, he drew himself up into rather a stiff and formal attitude, and replied, "Well, no, sir." The juryman, for all his self-assertion, seemed to respect the reticence of a servant who declined to give his opinion in regard to such a matter, and, drawing complacently back, signified with a wave of his hand that he had no more to say. Immediately the excitable little man before mentioned slipped forward to the edge of his chair and asked, this time without hesitation, "At what time did you unfasten the house this morning?" "About 6, sir." "Now, could any one leave the house after that time without your knowledge?" Thomas glanced a trifle uneasily at his fellow servants, but answered up promptly, and as if without reserve, "I don't think it would be possible for anybody to leave this house after 6 in the morning without either myself or the cooks knowing of it. Folks don't jump from second-story windows in broad daylight, and as to leaving by the doors, the front door closes with such a slam all the house can hear it from top to bottom, and as for the back door, no one goes out of that can get clear of the yard without going by the kitchen window, and no one can go by our kitchen window without the cooks a seeing of them. That I can just swear to." And he cast a half-quizzing, half-malicious look at the round, red-faced individual in question, strongly suggestive of late and unforgotten bickerings over the kitchen coffee-urn and castor. This reply, which was of a nature calculated to deepen the forebodings which had already settled upon the minds of those present, produced a visible effect. The house found locked, and no one seen to leave it. Evidently, then, we had not far to look for the assassin. Shifting on his chair with increased fervour, if I may so speak, the juryman glanced sharply round, but perceiving the renewed interest in the faces about him, declined to weaken the effect of the last admission by any further questions. Settling, therefore, comfortably back, he left the field open for any other juror who might choose to press the inquiry. But no one seeming to be ready to do this, Thomas in his turn evinced impatience, and at last, looking respectfully around, inquired, "Would any other gentleman like to ask me anything?" No one replying, he threw a hurried glance of relief towards the servants at his side. Then, while each one marvelled at the sudden change that had taken place in his countenance, withdrew with an eager alacrity and evident satisfaction for which I could not at the moment account. But the next witness proving to be none other than my acquaintance of the morning, Mr. Harwell, I soon forgot both Thomas and the doubts his last movement had awakened, in the interest which the examination of so important a person as the secretary and right-hand man of Mr. Leavenworth was likely to create. Advancing with the calm and determined air of one who realized that life and death itself might hang upon his words, Mr. Harwell took his stand before the jury with a degree of dignity not only highly prepossessing in itself, but to me, who had not been over and above pleased with him in our first interview, admirable and surprising, lacking, as I have said, any distinctive quality of face or form, agreeable or otherwise, being what you might call in appearance a negative sort of person, his pale, regular features, dark, well-smoothed hair, and simple whiskers, all belonging to a recognized type and very commonplace, there was still visible, on this occasion at least, a certain self-possession in his carriage, which went far towards making up for the want of impressiveness in his countenance and expression. Not that even this was in any way remarkable. Indeed, there was nothing remarkable about the man, any more than there is about 1,000 others you meet every day on Broadway, unless you except the look of concentration and solemnity which pervaded his whole person. A solemnity which at this time would not have been noticeable, perhaps, if it had not appeared to be the habitual expression of one who in his short life had seen more of sorrow than joy, less of pleasure than care and anxiety. The coroner, to whom his appearance one way or the other seemed to be a matter of no moment, addressed him immediately and without reserve. "Your name?" "James Trueman Harwell." "Your business?" "I have occupied the position of private secretary and amanuensis to Mr. Leavenworth for the past 8 months." "You are the person who last saw Mr. Leavenworth alive, are you not?" The young man raised his head with a haughty gesture which well nigh transfigured it. "Certainly not, as I am not the man who killed him." The answer, which seemed to introduce something akin to levity or badinage into an examination, the seriousness of which we were all beginning to realize, produced an immediate revulsion of feeling towards the man, who, in face of facts revealed, and to be revealed, could so lightly make use of it. A hum of disapproval swept through the room, and in that one remark James Harwell lost all that he had previously won by the self-possession of his bearing and the unflinching regard of his eye. He seemed himself to realize this, for he lifted his head still higher, though his general aspect remained unchanged. "I mean," the coroner exclaimed, evidently nettled that the young man had been able to draw such a conclusion from his words, "that you were the last one to see him previous to his assassination by some unknown individual." The secretary folded his arms, whether to hide a certain tremble which had seized him, or by that simple action to gain time for a moment's further thought, I could not then determine. "Sir," he replied at length, "I cannot answer yes or no to that question. In all probability I was the last to see him in good health and spirits, but in a house as large as this I cannot be sure of even so simple a fact as that." Then, observing the unsatisfied look on the faces around, added slowly, "It is my business to see him late." "Your business? Oh, as his secretary, I suppose." He gravely nodded. "Mr. Harwell," the coroner went on, "the office of private secretary in this country is not a common one. Will you explain to us what your duties were in that capacity? In short, what use Mr. Leavenworth had for such an assistant, and how he employed you?" "Certainly. Mr. Leavenworth was, as you perhaps know, a man of great wealth, connected with various societies, clubs, institutions, etc. Besides being known far and near as a giving man, he was accustomed every day of his life to receive numerous letters, begging and otherwise, which it was my business to open and answer, his private correspondence always bearing a mark upon it which distinguished it from the rest. But this was not all I was expected to do. Having in his early life been engaged in the tea trade, he had made more than one voyage to China, and was consequently much interested in the question of international communication between that country and our own. Thinking that in his various visits there he had learned much which, if known to the American people, would conduce to our better understanding of the nation, its peculiarities, and the best manner of dealing with it, he has been engaged for some time in writing a book on the subject, which same it has been my business for the last 8 months to assist him in preparing, by writing at his dictation 3 hours out of the 24, the last hour being commonly taken from the evening, say from 9:30 to 10:30, Mr. Leavenworth being a very methodical man, and accustomed to regulate his own life and that of those about him with almost mathematical precision." "You say you were accustomed to write at his dictation evenings. Did you do this as usual last evening?" "I did, sir." "What can you tell us of his manner and appearance at the time? Were they in any way unusual?" A frown crossed the secretary's brow. "As he probably had no premonition of his doom, why should there have been any change in his manner?" This giving the coroner an opportunity to revenge himself for his discomfiture of a moment before, he said somewhat severely, "It is the business of a witness to answer questions, not to put them." The secretary flushed, and the account stood even. "Very well then, sir. If Mr. Leavenworth felt any forebodings of his end, he did not reveal them to me. On the contrary, he seemed to be more absorbed in his work than usual. One of the last words he said to me was, 'In a month we will have this book in press, eh, Trueman?' I remember this particularly, as he was filling his wine glass at the time. He always drank 1 glass of wine before retiring, it being my duty to bring the decanter of sherry from the closet the last thing before leaving him. I was standing with my hand on the knob of the hall door, but advanced as he said this, and replied, 'I hope so indeed, Mr. Leavenworth.' 'Then join me in drinking a glass of sherry,' said he, motioning me to procure another glass from the closet. I did so, and he poured me out the wine with his own hand. I am not especially fond of sherry, but the occasion was a pleasant one, and I drained my glass. I remember being slightly ashamed of doing so, for Mr. Leavenworth set his down half full. It was half full when we found him this morning." Do what he would, and being a reserved man, he appeared anxious to control his emotion. The horror of his first shock seemed to overwhelm him here. Pulling his handkerchief from his pocket, he wiped his forehead. "Gentlemen, that is the last action of Mr. Leavenworth I ever saw. As he set the glass down on the table, I said good night to him and left the room." The coroner, with a characteristic imperviousness to all expressions of emotion, leaned back and surveyed the young man with a scrutinizing glance. "And where did you go then?" he asked. "To my own room." "Did you meet anybody on the way?" "No, sir." "Hear anything or see anything unusual?" The secretary's voice fell a trifle. "No, sir." "Mr. Harwell, think again. Are you ready to swear that you neither met anybody, heard anybody, nor saw anything which lingers yet in your memory as unusual?" His face grew quite distressed. Twice he opened his lips to speak, and as often closed them without doing so. At last, with an effort, he replied: "I saw one thing, a little thing, too slight to mention, but it was unusual, and I could not help thinking of it when you spoke." "What was it?" "Only a door half open." "Whose door?" "Miss Eleanor Leavenworth's." His voice was almost a whisper now. "Where were you when you observed this fact?" "I cannot say exactly. Probably at my own door, as I did not stop on the way. If this frightful occurrence had not taken place, I should never have thought of it again." "When you went into your room, did you close your door?" "I did, sir." "How soon did you retire?" "Immediately." "Did you hear nothing before you fell asleep?" Again that indefinable hesitation. "Barely nothing." "Not a footstep in the hall?" "I might have heard a footstep." "Did you?" "I cannot swear I did." "Do you think you did?" "Yes, I think I did. To tell the whole, I remember hearing, just as I was falling into a doze, a rustle and a footstep in the hall, but it made no impression upon me, and I dropped asleep." "Well?" "Some time later I woke suddenly as if something had startled me, but what, a noise or move, I cannot say. I remember rising up in my bed and looking round, but hearing nothing further, soon yielded to the drowsiness which possessed me and fell into a deep sleep. I did not wake again till morning." Here requested to relate how and when he became acquainted with the fact of the murder, he substantiated in all particulars the account of the matter already given by the butler, which subject being exhausted, the coroner went on to ask if he had noted the condition of the library table after the body had been removed. "Somewhat, yes, sir." "What was on it?" "The usual properties, sir. Books, paper, a pen with the ink dried on it, besides the decanter and the wine glass from which he drank the night before." "Nothing more?" "I remember nothing more."
"In regard to that decanter and glass," broke in the juryman of the watch and chain, "did you not say that the latter was found in the same condition in which you saw it at the time you left Mr. Leavenworth sitting in his library?"
"Yes, sir, very much."
"Yet he was in the habit of drinking a full glass?"
"Yes, sir."
"An interruption must then have ensued very close upon your departure, Mr. Harwell."
A cold bluish pallor suddenly broke out upon the young man's face. He started, and for a moment looked as if struck by some horrible thought. "That does not follow, sir," he articulated with some difficulty. "Mr. Leavenworth might—" but suddenly stopped, as if too much distressed to proceed.
"Go on, Mr. Harwell. Let us hear what you have to say."
"There is nothing," he returned faintly, as if battling with some strong emotion. As he had not been answering a question, only volunteering an explanation, the coroner let it pass, but I saw more than one pair of eyes roll suspiciously from side to side, as if many there felt that some sort of clue had been offered them in this man's emotion. The coroner, ignoring in his easy way both the emotion and the universal excitement it had produced, now proceeded to ask: "Do you know whether the key to the library was in its place when you left the room last night?" "No, sir, I did not notice." "The presumption is it was?" "I suppose so." "At all events, the door was locked in the morning and the key gone?" "Yes, sir." "Then whoever committed this murder
locked the door on passing out, and took away the key?"
"It would seem so." The coroner, turning, faced the jury with an earnest look.
"Gentlemen," said he, "there seems to be a mystery in regard to this key which must be looked into."
Immediately a universal murmur swept through the room, testifying to the acquiescence of all present. The little juryman, hastily rising, proposed that an instant search should be made for it, but the coroner, turning upon him with what I should denominate as a quelling look, decided that the inquest should proceed in the usual manner till the verbal testimony was all in.
"Then allow me to ask a question," again volunteered the irrepressible. "Mr. Harwell, we are told that upon the breaking in of the library door this morning, Mr. Leavenworth's two nieces followed you into the room."
"One of them, sir, Miss Eleanor."
"Is Miss Eleanor the one who is said to be Mr. Leavenworth's sole heiress?" the coroner here interposed.
"No, sir, that is Miss Mary."
"That she gave orders," pursued the juryman, "for the removal of the body into the further room?"
"Yes, sir."
"And that you obeyed her by helping to carry it in?"
"Yes, sir."
"Now, in thus passing through the rooms, did you observe anything to lead you to form a suspicion of the murderer?"
The secretary shook his head. "I have no suspicion," he emphatically said. Somehow I did not believe him. Whether it was the tone of his voice, the clutch of his hand on his sleeve, and the hand will often reveal more than the countenance, I felt that this man was not to be relied upon in making this assertion.
"I should like to ask Mr. Harwell a question," said a juryman who had not yet spoken. "We have had a detailed account of what looks like the discovery of a murdered man. Now, murder is never committed without some motive. Does the secretary know whether Mr. Leavenworth had any secret enemy?"
"I do not."
"Every one in the house seemed to be on good terms with him?"
"Yes, sir," with a little quaver of dissent in the assertion, however.
"Not a shadow lay between him and any other members of his household, so far as you know?"
"I am not ready to say that," he returned, quite distressed. "A shadow is a very slight thing. There might have been a shadow."
"Between him and whom?"
A long hesitation. "One of his nieces, sir."
"Which one?"
Again that defiant lift of the head. "Miss Eleanor."
"How long has this shadow been observable?"
"I cannot say."
"You do not know the cause?"
"I do not."
"Nor the extent of the feeling?"
"No, sir."
"You open Mr. Leavenworth's letters?"
"I do."
"Has there been anything in his correspondence of late calculated to throw any light upon this deed?"
It actually seemed as if he never would answer. Was he simply pondering over his reply, or was the man turned to stone?
"Mr. Harwell, did you hear the juryman?" inquired the coroner.
"Yes, sir, I was thinking."
"Very well. Now answer."
"Sir," he replied, turning and looking the juryman full in the face, and in that way revealing his unguarded left hand to my gaze, "I have opened Mr. Leavenworth's letters as usual for the last 2 weeks, and I can think of nothing in them bearing in the least upon this tragedy." The man lied. I knew it instantly. The clenched hand, pausing irresolute, then making up its mind to go through with the lie firmly, was enough for me.
"Mr. Harwell, this is undoubtedly true according to your judgment," said the coroner, "but Mr. Leavenworth's correspondence will have to be searched for all that."
"Of course," he replied carelessly. "That is only right." This remark ended Mr. Harwell's examination for the time. As he sat down, I made note of 4 things. That Mr. Harwell himself, for some reason not given, was conscious of a suspicion which he was anxious to suppress even from his own mind. That a woman was in some way connected with it, a rustle as well as a footstep having been heard by him on the stairs. That a letter had arrived at the house, which, if found, would be likely to throw some light upon this subject. That Eleanor Leavenworth's name came with difficulty from his lips. This evidently unimpressible man manifesting more or less emotion whenever he was called upon to utter it.
All right, so James Truman Harwell has become kind of a complicated person. By the way, since you're not seeing this on a page, James Truman is not spelled like Harry Truman. It is spelled Trueman, and Harwell is Harwell, which makes perfect sense. We have some interesting things happening with the butler. He seems very stand-up and forthright and everything, but he did cast a slant eye at the cook at some point, who seemed kind of flustered. So there's something going on. And then Harwell's not doing a good job of protecting the ladies of the family, if that's what he was setting out to do, because Eleanor is certainly starting to look a little fishy. We haven't remotely met the girls yet. We have seen a painting. Our narrator, Mr. Raymond, he saw the painting last week of a very young, attractive woman in neoclassical garb in Jane Austen Regency era style. And we still haven't got a clue if that's either of the women, and if so, which one. And we'll just have to wait a little bit more until we find that out. I think I mentioned last week, every so often in this book would get women in white vibes. And there are several reasons for it. But I started to wonder if it wasn't just me kind of being dim yesterday. And I had to go look up the women in white's characters. And the reason is because James Harwell seems very close to Hartwell, somebody who, for instance, loves well. And I kept thinking, but the guy who was the narrator, the primary narrator in Women in White, wasn't he a Hart something? Was he a Hartwell? Oh my gosh, am I just pulling Women in White out of the bag because these two guys' names are the same or very close to the same? I have to send my apologies to Walter Hartwright from The Woman in White, because his heart was right, not well. So, in case you two have forgotten long ago in those past foggy days, when I was moving from Arizona to Virginia, characters: Laura Fairley, Marian Halcombe, Walter Hartwright, and then, of course, Count Fosco, the best villain ever. I feel no compunction about saying that. I am frequently hyperbolic, but rarely do I fling superlatives around meaninglessly. Like best, worst. It always made me very nervous to say best friend because, I don't know. How do you judge that? I have friends who I love very much. Best? It makes me uncomfortable. I don't know what's wrong with me, except that it makes me uncomfortable. I have no problem with claiming, I will die on this hill, Count Fosco, best villain ever. I'm about ready to go back and listen to that book again. That's how good Count Fosco is. Love that guy. So, if you were having Women in White flashbacks and starting to wonder about names, now you too have the answer. Walter Hartwright versus James Truman, a true man, Harwell, not Hartwell. There's one other thing that popped up in today's chapter that I thought was interesting. At one point, the coroner, I believe, I don't think it's one of the jurymen, I think it's the coroner, asks our lovely Irish butler, was the door locked? And he said, or was the door locked from the inside? And he said, I couldn't tell, no key was in the door, which by modern standards seems a rather odd thing to say. Somebody will correct me if I'm wrong, perhaps my mother, but I think I have a memory of playing with what to my eye look like skeleton keys. Actually, quite a bit like the keys that I drew for the art for this book's iTunes button. Kind of old-fashioned skeleton key-y like. These, in my memory, these are very simple. There's the shaft of the key, and then there's the part that drops down on these old-fashioned keys. and the part that drops down has little cutouts that will trip the tumblers inside the lock. I don't remember these keys as having more than one, maybe tops two cutouts. The locks that these keys went to didn't seem to have a whole lot happening on the inside. The reason why I am thinking this is probably true is I think these were keys to my great-grandmother's back rooms, like the bedroom, and I don't remember what her back room was. Her home was laid out very similarly, as far as I remember, to the house that we were in, because they were like craftsman cottages in Southern California. So slightly mission style in the construction, but I don't think there was any mission style built-ins like you get in some places in Southern California. So I'm not sure what door the keys went to. And actually, maybe it was just a china closet. I don't remember. But I do remember this, that if you put the key in on one side of the door and looked from the other side of the door, you would have your view blocked by the key. If you took the key out, you could look all the way through. This is the peeping in at keyholes thing. We typically don't have door locks that function like this anymore. Deadbolts certainly don't. And now perhaps we understand why deadbolts are such a great invention. But yes, so the door was locked. There was no key in the door, so there was no way to tell which side it was locked from. It was simply locked and the key had been removed. You could look through the lock into the room. That was it. Just in case you hadn't been around that kind of thing before. Thought I'd add that in. All right, last final things to share with you. As if the last couple of weeks weren't hard enough for Craftlit listeners, Christa, who comes to Thursday night Zooms, who also has a past in Arizona, as well as Tracee. Christa's dog Toph, I hope I said the dog's name correctly, is a very important companion to Christa and was getting sick. And finally, Christa was able to get Toph to a vet. There's a fast-growing tumor that needs to come out. And Christa has set up a GoFundMe page. So if you are an animal fan and a people need animals fan, please consider going and donating something to Christa via her GoFundMe page. The link is in the show notes for this episode. The final thing, you can imagine that with 2 funerals happening concurrently for Tracee and her family, her husband Michael's has kind of tipped over the edge of what is affordable / doable. It would be lovely if you could to also visit Tracee's GoFundMe page for funeral expenses. And for both Christa and Tracee, if you're not on Facebook and you have any personal messages that you would like me to get to them, I am more than happy to forward those to them as well. So again, heather@craftlit.com, as well as 206-350-1642. If you want to leave a message there that you don't want played on an episode, you just want it to get to Tracee or Christa, I am happy to forward along the MP3 file to them as well. It's just too much. As Tracee said last night, if there is a positive light to be cast at all on what she's been going through, it was that her husband was an organ donor. And while they were too late to rescue any of the major organs, vital organs, skin grafts and eyes, and I think there was something else. Oh, bone marrow and bone grafts. He is available for that. And I don't know if no, I must have at some point. A good friend of mine from high school, when he was in dental school and then orthodontia school, worked for Angel's Flight, the network of pilots who have their own planes who will, at the drop of a hat, show up at an airport to pick up a person who is carrying organs that need to be rushed to another city in order to be transplanted. And I learned from him an awful lot about what that can mean to the recipients. And so if you haven't thought before about being an organ donor yourself, please reconsider. It is a gift that keeps giving and truly transformative thing that you can do for others. My uncle also flew Angels Flight flights. My friend wasn't a pilot. He was actually the guy carrying the cooler, the plastic bin that had the ice packs in it and the whatever the part was that was being rushed to be transplanted. And he was the one responsible for making sure that the temperature was consistent and that the organ actually reached where it was supposed to reach in a viable state. Yeah. So, hard week, but a lot of love going out to Christa and especially to Tracee. Just too much. It's been a real lousy couple of years, hasn't it? All right. Be well. Please take care of each other. Wear a mask. I'll talk to you soon. Bye. If you like what you hear on Craftlit, please review us on iTunes, like us on Facebook, join in the fun in our Facebook group, which is Craftlit Annotated Audiobooks. Always the nicest group of people you're going to find on Facebook, and the place where you can come to and say, nobody else was going to understand this, but I knew you all would. And of course, thank you for your support of Craftlit. And remember, if your hands are too busy to pick up a book, at least you can turn one on.